Elements of fantasy. You guys are going to be writing your own fantasy story throughout this week. I'm going to guide you through it, but first we need to cover the general ideas of a fantasy story. Fantasy is a very broad topic, or a very broad genre, so we're just going to cover a few of the basics. The first thing in a fantasy story is that characters may be doing things that they cannot do in the real world. For example, fish could be flying. Now I know there is a thing called a flying fish, but in reality, all it does is jump. A flying pig is another example. A flying pig is another example of a character doing things that they could not in the real world. Animals talking. Again, personification. And then magic. In a lot of fantasy stories or fairy tales, there's magical element. Characters can do magic. There's wizards, or they have some special ability. Yes, Delvin?
Like Cinderella and the Godmother?
Yes, exactly. Like Cinderella and the Godmother. There's magic. Yes?
Harry Potter.
Harry Potter. Again, great examples. These are all great examples of characters.
Oh.
These are all great examples of characters that produce things that they cannot normally do in our real world. So the characters might do things not from this world. The events that take place in the story, all right, the whole guiding force behind the story may be something that couldn't happen in the real world. For example, raising the dead. That doesn't just happen in our real world. It could happen in a fantasy story. People come back to life. Or maybe raising the dead is simply calling a ghost to come talk to you. Now maybe that does happen in the real world. I'm not one to say. Another thing could be alien invasion. Science fiction is another type of fantasy. Okay, that's just something that couldn't happen in the real world. The plot of the story could be unrealistic, or again, it has a magical element. So we've talked about characters and the plot, the guiding force of the story. Another thing specific to fantasy stories is the setting. The setting of the story could be unrealistic. Okay, maybe you live in an underwater city like the city of Atlantis. Okay, it's a whole city, but it's underwater. Or like in the Sim-Chung story, the water dragon, the girl just goes and lives underwater. A regular human girl goes and lives underwater. Could be the city of gold, the city of El Dorado. Maybe that does exist. I don't recommend spending your whole life searching for it, though. There could be a city in space. All right, again, these are all things that don't happen in our real world, that happen in fantasy stories. You good?
No.
Close? This one, the city in space, I'm guessing that in your lifetime, that will not be part of fantasy. That will be part of the real world.
In the future.
They're working on it, right?
Mars.
Mars, that's in space.
No.
All right. Another thing about fantasy is, if you remember when you read your stories, a lot of them were told as though it was real. If you guys watch a movie or a TV show that's fake, that's fiction, they don't usually start out by saying, hey, this is fake, don't believe a word of it. They usually start out trying to bring you in, telling it like a story. Once upon a time, once there was a king. All right, these fantasy stories are usually told like memories or like a narrative. We wrote a personal narrative earlier in the year. Do you remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Yes? Good. It's the story. There's a lot of details. They want you to believe it. Like, when you're telling a fantasy story, you want to tell it as though it really happened. Instead of giving on the cues that it's made up, there can be made up things, but write them as though you believe them. And then the tone of the story. How does this story sound? Okay, when we listen to music or different sounds, the tone is what it sounds like, or the feeling that it gives you. Okay, and fantasy stories have generally 3 specific tones. Either happiness, nostalgia, which is like looking back, remembering. Okay, kind of, you could twist it into almost a historical context. Going back to like medieval times, the knights and dragons and things like that. Or they could have a tone of danger. Dangerous things happen in fantasy stories. Alright? Sometimes people slay dragons, sometimes they fight beasts. You know, sometimes they're just on this magical quest and they gotta do dangerous things. They may have to cross a lot of land with little supplies. Okay? There may be a super villain or job of is forgetting everything you already know. Alright? The characters that you've seen in TV shows, that you've read books about, that you've done different things with, forget them. I want your characters. You are going to create a character. Alright? I don't want it to be SpongeBob. I don't want it to be Zelda or anything like that. These are all characters that have been created. So we are going to create our own characters this week. Alright? Sure, yeah, like Billy the Turtle or Richard the Goldfish. Those are original characters. We're going to create more characters like that. Alright? Okay, that's what we're going to do this week.